Hi, I'm Doug Links, and this video is a tutorial showing how to use Runtime Compiled C++ with the Dear ImGui DirectX11 example. So it'll show basically how to use Dear ImGui and also how to use DirectX11 in this case with Runtime Compiled C++ on Windows with Visual Studio. So without further ado, I'll show you what we have here. So this is a Dear ImGui DirectX11 example to which I've added one tiny little window. Dear ImGui is an excellent means to add Windows and graphical user interface code to any rendering example, to any game. In particular was the original aim for Dear ImGui. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a small change at runtime. So I'm going to basically add another sentence. So yes, I can change code. And there we see that it appears over here in this window. That's a fairly simple change. You can probably do that with Visual Studio's Edit and Continue, but there are other larger changes which you can't. So for example, I'm going to add in here a new variable, the present interval, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow the user to change the present interval. So that is the interval with which the DirectX code will allow the monitor to be refreshed. So here we're getting 60 milliseconds or 60 frames per second, which is due to the fact that we have hard-coded in here at the end of our rendering code that we present with every single interval. So basically that means that every time the monitor gets one refresh, we will try to present the frame that we have rendered if we're rendering fast enough. So, I mean, we can actually obviously just, if I go down here, I can actually just change that in code by setting that to 0 with Runtime Compiled C++. And then after a few seconds, we see that we're now rendering at less than a millisecond, several thousand frames per second. So we're ignoring the refresh rate of the monitor in this case, and most of the frames won't be observed. Go back to putting that to 1. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this present interval member that I've added. I'm then going to serialize that. The reason why I'm serializing this is because we want to preserve state between compiles. This is not absolutely necessary, but it makes for a good end user experience when you can make a change to your application's data set, or you can watch your application's data change over time, such as in a game when it's playing. You can then make a change to your code. You can save that change out, and then it restores itself to exactly the moment before the code was changed, so that everything looks pretty much the same except for the new code you've added. So this present interval I can then use, but so far I'm not able to do anything with it. But using Dear ImGui, I can actually add in here a simple ImGui input int in this case for this value. Again, the text for that's just going to be present interval, and we have to pass a pointer to the value that we've added, and then we'll be able to change this once we save it out. So that comes over on this window here, and we can see we've got this present interval which we can change to 0, and that changes the frame rate back to less than a millisecond. It's in debug, but it's still running fairly fast because there's not that much for it to do. And we can increase that to 60 frames per second in that case, 2, and then we go to half that. So this is an example which the code for which is available online on GitHub under my account called rccpp dx11 example with underscores. And the code is using Runtime Compiled C++ and Dear ImGui as submodules. And then there's a few classes and members within that. And I'm going to show you how to build this up from scratch. But if you'd rather just read along with the tutorial, which we'll publish online, likely on our Enkisoftware website, then you can follow this code. And we have a number of branches in the code, which are at various points within the tutorial. So we have the project setup, which is the part that I'll be doing next. On top of the project setup, we get Runtime Compiled C++ working. Then we add some ImGui code so that we have Runtime Compiled C++ working with ImGui. And then we do the same with Direct3D, followed by linking the Direct3D library so that we can use Direct3D functions. And as we'll explain later, you can actually use Direct3D without linking to the library because it has a virtual interface for most of its device state. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of approaches to which you can get the tutorial code, one of which basically is doing a git clone. So if you close this window and then I open one up and I go into, in this case, I'm doing everything from my desktop, which is terrible. So I'm going to create a new folder from GitHub using Git. So I'm going to basically go into this folder and then use Git to get hold of the code. So here I'm going to use Git bash. I usually actually use a GUI for quite a lot of my work. The Git fork is pretty wonderful. And we're going to do a git clone recursively, so it grabs all of the submodules, which there are two, Runtime Compiled C++ and Dear ImGui, and then passing it the link to the Git repository for Dear ImGui. And of course, paste is different for bash. So this is going to clone that out. Whilst that's doing a clone, we can just go back to our code and take a little bit of a look. So we have a solution for Runtime Compiled C++. We have a project file for the code, which we're going to make. We have a project file for the runtime compiler, project file for the runtime object system. So in Visual Studio, a project file actually is, there are two main files that you need for that. So you have the vcxproj and the vcxproj.filters. I'm using a logging system that I've made called the stdio log system, which also logs to the Visual Studio output. And we'll go into the rest of this code in detail as we build it up. So over here, we'll see that this has downloaded the code into a folder called rccpp. And if we cd into that and take a look at its contents, we can see that we pretty much have what we have over here on the right. And most importantly, using Git, if you were to do that, you'll find that you also have the contents of the Dear ImGui and the Runtime Compiled C++ repository, and you'll have the contents of those at the point at which I made this code. So everything should just work for you if you compile and run that. So for example, let's open up the solution. So this is a solution with the same name, obviously, because it's run from Git. If I press F7 for compile, that's how I'm set up. It'll go through and compile that. And I like to put this on one side and run. And using Windows right arrow, I can then put my window over to the right-hand side. And then I can go into the file, find the runtime compiled code. And then over here, I can pretty much do the same code. Typos come free. And there we go. So basically, yeah, that's very quick up and running. So this is a good starting point at which you can use to do some Dear ImGui code if that's all you're interested in. Play around with Dear ImGui at this point at runtime, and you can do a fair amount in here without problems. All right, so I'll close that down and show you the other way to get the code. So the other approach to getting the code is you could basically download it. So from GitHub using downloaded. So I'll go in there and I don't need the bash window anymore. So this is slightly more complicated because when you download from the GitHub account, you'll find that the zip that you get will not include any of the submodules. So that should download into my downloads folder. There we go. So I can then just move that over there for the moment. And then what you can do to get hold of the Runtime Compiled C++ and ImGui at the same point as the code you've downloaded is you can open up the links from the folder on the front page of this example. So here I'm just going to open those two. And then when you do the download, I'll do this for both of those. I'll tab back to my downloads folder, Right, so we've got runtime compiled. And so we need Dear ImGui next. So I'll download that. And basically this will take it at the point of the code, as I mentioned, that was working with the Runtime Compiled C++ DirectX11 example we've made. And then I'll move that across. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to extract these files. Runtime Compiled C++. I'm just going to dump that over there. Right. So what we have, the structure that we have is, again, we have the code that we downloaded from the example, and then we have in Runtime Compiled C++ the code from there, and in ImGui I haven't moved the ImGui code across. Right, and in ImGui we have the code from ImGui. So this approach is how you can basically get hold of the code yourself if you are doing this from the GitHub example, but you want to download it, which is actually harder than using Git in this case. Even if you don't like using Git, but you have Git installed, I'd recommend using Git just to get hold of the code, and from there on in you can forget about the fact that Git exists.